all in all, today's been a pretty good day, I think.
Yeah.
I agree.
And we all just kind of hung out, talked, went to the COP, and I don't know, I got to see a couple of really interesting booths. I love Thailand. I loved having and sharing some tea with those people, learning about their fisheries. But what were some of you guys' favorite highlights?
One of my favorite highlights was listening to the United States CEOs talk about this climate statement that a bunch of CEOs and business leaders in the United States are signing to say that they are still committed to achieving the Paris Agreement. And they had different stats displayed on the screen. Like 42% of the emissions are accounted for with that group of CEOs that are signing the statement, which is a pretty significant amount. And usually when we think of federal action, we think of the whole U.S. sort of going in that direction. But really it's quite the opposite. We see this gap growing between the private and government sector in regards to climate action. And so it was just interesting for me to listen to what the CEOs had to say about climate action. And a lot of them were just basically sort of echoing the same points, that it is the best investment, not only from a business perspective, but from a people perspective, to continue investing in clean energy and less carbon intensive manufacturing processes.
That's really awesome. So what was one of the methods that they discussed? Just if you can remember it offhand.
Yeah. So one of the, let me think about what exactly they said. I know that they didn't go into specifics about what they were doing at their own companies. They
that they have patents for that.
Yeah, they were just talking about the more generally. They were talking about it was a pretty short talk. It was about 25 minutes, and so they didn't have too much time to go into the details. They pretty much just gave us the numbers. They gave us reasons why other businesses should go into and sign this statement, and why it's best for their own interest to mitigate risk. They talked a lot about that, mitigating risk and managing risk, and that this is one of the ways you can do that is by making your company more resilient as fossil fuels run out, as we see increased severe weather, etc.
That's really awesome. And something I've found just from speaking with business owners, hearing about your CEOs, is that oftentimes the best thing for the environment is often the most efficient thing for the business. So the two go hand in hand a lot more than is led to believe in the popular rhetoric. So leading off of that, what were some of the other things that you guys found really cool with the conference?
Well, so one thing that I found really cool about the conference is just kind of the different aspects of how everybody, no matter if they're a party or an NGO or just kind of an independent body, they have their own thing that they can just kind of have their own little side events, their own spiels, and just talk about their own take about how they can, take action against climate change. And so, I mean, one of the really cool events that I think I went to is we went to a press conference that basically talked about the indigenous people who lived in the Amazon area, and they were talking about protecting just the headwaters of the Amazon and kind of trying to raise awareness about trying to prevent major industries from coming into the area to mine and kind of take away those natural resources that the Amazon provides for them. And so one of the things that they were talking about is the official from Peru, he talked about how the Amazon is the lungs of the earth, and he called it ill because industries are taking advantage of it for money. However, we cannot eat money, so there is really no point in taking advantage of the Amazon for money. So their whole thing was just to advocate against major industries coming in to tear down their forests and to pollute their waters and everything. And it was just really interesting to see. There were a lot of tribe leaders up at this press conference. They didn't speak, but they were available to be individually interviewed afterwards. And I just thought that it was really awesome that people who wouldn't normally have a voice had a voice during this press conference, and people who normally wouldn't even, be considered as someone to be influential, they are influential at this conference, and that's kind of what it's all about. is just everyone coming together to do what they can to take action against the negative effects of climate change. So
to kind of add to that, I actually found this video on I think it's on YouTube, but it's a NASA satellite imaging of carbon dioxide levels in different seasons, and so you can see throughout the year like the earth breathing, and it almost looks like a heartbeat in places like the Amazon and rainforest in Indonesia, and just thinking about how deforestation and different destructive processes are going to take that away, right, is really sad.
So I also got to sit in on this Indigenous Peoples Board, and it was one of the most unique takes I've seen on this, like in the conference so far. Granted, this is my first full real day of conference negotiations and press talks, but they didn't really hammer home on demonizing one specific group. They called out everyone who was involved, but then they just said we have to work towards reformation, not just straight punishment. And I thought that was a really neat take on it. If you're able to find the things online, I would highly recommend looking in and reading it. And it was recorded by a lot of press people, so it's on YouTube somewhere. So if I can find it, you'll see it in the edits. But if not, we're gonna move on.
Actually, if I could quickly add, I didn't attend the Indigenous Peoples press conference, although I really wanted to. But I did glance at an article that I saw earlier that was written by someone from a tribe, and he was talking about how not just the way climate change affects their, like, where they live, because they're more, like, they're closer in contact with the environment, but also it affects, like, the politics of their region. So, like, that affects, like, the different territories and, like, the politics that goes into how, like, the land is distributed and, like, how they interact with other Indigenous people. And I thought that was really interesting, seeing how it's not just about, you know, their interaction with the environment, it's how they interact with other people too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and to add on to kind of answer what Baxter's question was a little earlier about, you know, what is good about this conference in general is, and add on to what you said earlier about how they weren't necessarily demonizing one certain company who was, you know, had a presence in the Amazon. That's kind of a thing that I like about this conference, is that there is not necessarily a lot of finger pointing and a lot of blaming specific people for, you know, large problems that are going on this planet. It's more just having a conversation and figuring out, you know, what is this problem? How can we deal with it? And, you know, what is going wrong and what can we do to make it go right? So that's another thing that I think is really valuable about this conference, is just the ability for people to come together and have an actual conversation, a climate conversation about working together to make this planet right.
We need to have like a little buzzword or a little noise every time we say climate conversation.
Hey, Ian, put in like a ding, ding, ding. Thank you.
I think it's interesting that you say that, and I totally agree that that's the point and the purpose. And then those of us who were watching the Article in the 6 negotiations this morning might have a different interpretation of how that is working, because everyone is really pushing their own agenda, and there is the kind of like desired perception that it's a collective effort, but we saw certain countries insisting that the word human rights was taken out of specific requirements, or other countries saying, well, no, we want this statement also revised and this statement also revised, and it's obviously important because it's a member-driven process that everyone is able to voice their opinions and make sure that their needs are met. And sometimes it's also, I think, definitely overwhelming when you have such a wide variety of diverse needs and perspectives that sometimes seem just really, really difficult to meet. And it took almost 2 hours to get through one paragraph of revisions because there were so many distinct opinions about what they should contain.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that we're not just going to sit here and praise the UN and praise COP25 because that's not actually what promoting science literacy and talking about the problem is. Yeah, we could generate a lot of hype by doing that, but if we want to have a real conversation, a real discussion about these issues, we have to start breaking down what it is that is actually going on. So what was one thing that you guys were kind of less than satisfied with in your time so far at COP?
One thing that I was really frustrated with is that these negotiations seem to be happening in a sort of old-fashioned way. Like, we have all of this technology and people feel like they have to reiterate themselves, otherwise they'll feel like only one party was heard. But we have technology that can keep track of which opinions are heard and which aren't. It could be as simple as if a country says something, maybe they could all have a button with a visual board up there, and every time they agree with it, all the countries could press agree or disagree. So there's a visual seeing like how these negotiations are playing out in real time, instead of trying to remember just by listening to 15 different countries talk over 2 hours and 30 minutes. That's something that was really frustrating for me, is that we have all of this technology. Why can't we use it to facilitate these negotiations?
And that's really solid.
Yeah, this is true. And I mean, the dais this morning that was, in the negotiations of Article 6, he himself was getting frustrated with the delegates from other countries who would, pitch in their own opinions about why they think a certain revision should be made or why a certain word should not be added into the resolution that is being crafted at the moment. And there was a moment in the negotiations where he said, I think it was to the delegate of, I don't even remember what country it was from, but he just said, sir, like, we don't need to hear your commentary. We don't need to hear your opinion. Just tell us what you want to be fixed. And so it is kind of frustrating because it takes a lot longer.
Yeah, that was Russia.
Yep.
Russia, yeah, it takes a lot longer than it needs to, I think.
So one of the things that really surprised me was the amount that these countries coming to this conference were spending on representing themselves rather than dealing with issues related to climate or issues related to their own public welfare.
Yeah.
For example, India, who is having a lot of difficulties right now with their own personal infrastructure and just civilian standard of living, made this extravagant, and I mean extravagant, like almost a square block inside this building, just thing to show off and be like, this is what we're doing for the climate stuff. And when you go to that kind of an extreme to show what you're doing, you're kind of missing the point. It's no longer eco-friendly. It's no longer super sustainable, even if you're using the best materials for it. It's still over the top, in my opinion, but what are you guys' thoughts on that matter?
I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say, even the US, we're still in climate booth. Like, you have all these business leaders showing up and saying they're still in, and that's great, but they're still making a profit when we have a really high homeless population in our nation and a lot of people on welfare, a lot of people on Medicare and Medicaid and things, because they have that economic necessity. And I think it's questionable sometimes too, just the way that we're representing what we think is a positive thing. And I super support and believe it's a wonderful thing that that group exists and is presenting a much more positive image to the international stage than our current administration seems to be wanting to do. But I think it's still harmful sometimes, I think, to make accusations like that. Not that you were making an accusation, but
oh no, I'm definitely taking a hot side here to get this conversation rolling.
Yeah, I just think it's important. Like, if you're going to call out one side, I think it's important to call out the other side too.
Correct.
And I do think that business and economic factors are a big driving force for a lot of socioeconomic inequality in our nation. And so calling out business leaders and to accept culpability for that sometimes is important as well.
All right, cool. What else we got?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I mean, I'm not going to lie, my first thought whenever I did see the India pavilion was, I was kind of shocked. I said, wow, India, you spent so much money on this, very impressive
really
pavilion.
nice, yeah.
So nice. I mean, there's screens, like the entire wall of the Indian pavilion is just a giant screen, that is advocating for
it's like a video screen.
Yeah, good video screen. I mean, and my first thought when I saw that was, wow, India, you spent a lot of money on this. Obviously, you could have been using that for something else. But I mean, I guess that is hypocritical because I feel like you can ask that question for most everyone who is involved in this conference. Do you think that a conference this big and a conference this extravagant that is talking about, how to deal with climate emergencies, do you think that having such a conference that is this big and extravagant is worth all the money that is poured into it in order to talk about these issues? Because if you think about it, from your perspective, playing devil's advocate, everybody who is involved could be using this money that they're pouring into this conference to pour into something else to be more helpful.
And this actually brings me to a really fun conversation I had on the plane ride over here. My seat partner said, "Oh, so you're flying to a climate conference. This must be your entire carbon emission for the year." And I go, "Well, I'm not perfect, and I don't expect anyone to do everything perfectly.
Exactly.
Rather, we need, and this is something I've said before on the radio, we need 1 million people doing things imperfectly, trying to make a change, rather than 1,000 people who are perfect in every aspect. Because it's not what one person is doing that's going to really change the world. It's what the majority of us are doing most of the time."
Well, that's a super important point, because I think a lot of times people are reluctant to make any sort of change that they may deem inconvenient, simply because they feel like they don't have the power to change anything. And, we'll say well, I'm just one person. What impact do I really have? But if everybody says that, it has a really enormous and significant impact. And I think empowering people to realize the impact that their individual actions really can have, especially added up on the grand scale, it's something that's really important to be aware of and not belittle, I think.
Yeah.
Going off of that, because you had mentioned convenience, especially for in the US, I feel like in particular, we definitely have a culture of consumption, and we really value convenience. So, getting plastic bags every time we go to the grocery store, I don't have to worry about bringing my own bags, or things like that. We will take that over doing something that would actually be beneficial to the environment. So I think it's important to remember that we can't take that weight and that responsibility on ourselves completely, because it is a culture that we've grown up with, and to go against that is extremely hard. And sometimes it's really stressful when you just try to, in your everyday, do things more sustainably. And I think that's great, but also not to take that to a level where it becomes, stressful to yourself, because it's hard.
Well, a certain amount of stress is not necessarily a bad thing, but I'd like to backtrack a moment real quick. Sound good?
Yeah.
Christian, you are interested in financing and trying to figure out economical ways to change the world and stop climate change, right?
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about businesses and countries spending exorbitant amounts of money to come to this conference and to put on a show and try to get people involved. What do you think the return on investment is? Just why do they do this? Why is it worth their money to show up to a conference like this?
I would say it's worth their money because if they don't show up, it makes a bigger statement to everyone in the world than showing up and just sort of doing what everyone else is doing. And
But-
so,
I'm going to cut you off right there. But what about the thing we talked about last night, about the peoples who were unable to come here because they couldn't afford to, because it was no longer happening in Chile, the businesses and the people of South America? And I don't mean to call you out on this. It was just this happened to be your thing. But what do you think about keeping that in consideration? The culture of consumption that we have here in the U.S. How do you think all these things kind of tie together? This is a very abstract question.
yeah, I mean, I would say it's definitely not equitable to expect these countries, when a conference moves suddenly, to suddenly shift all of their investment that they just put into a conference that they're expecting to be attending, and then try and attend a conference in a completely opposite part of the world. One thing that I think would be really cool is if a country with more power, more privilege, such as a U.S., Australia, etc., could sort of amplify what those countries are saying, or maybe a neighboring country, so a country that is able to make it could do that, or the people, like we could have people that are able to make it represent those that aren't able to make it. I think amplification is a really powerful tool. Then again, I don't want it to be seen as like this person is patronizing them by like representing them because they couldn't make it. So I think it is a delicate balance between condescension and amplification. But I think if it's done the right way, then it could be really powerful and could show that interconnectedness of an ally that's a neighboring like country or person.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Thank you, Christian. So as we begin to wrap up, are there any closing thoughts? Just what did you learn today that you're going to take into tomorrow? Open floor.
So I did have one thing to say that had to do with what I said earlier. This isn't exactly a closing thought, but in terms of what I said earlier about kind of playing devil's advocate about why people are spending so much money to invest in this one conference when they could be using it to do something else. My personal argument to that question is I have heard a lot of criticism over the internet of people saying, why would you spend so much money? Why would you, waste carbon, flying over to this conference? And I think, honestly, my answer to that is that, if this conference didn't happen, a lot of the major actions, for good wouldn't happen. So sometimes I think this is one of those situations where it's where the ends justify the means.
Well, everything that you do is going to have some sort of opportunity or startup cost. And this just happens to be
This
ours.
is an initial investment for a long-term gain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yes.
And that's something that we've really gotten to see, at least in my opinion, through these first couple days during week 2. Moving forward, we're going to have a whole lot of heavy hitters coming in, and it's going to disrupt the flow of what we've been used to so far. However, keeping that in mind and what we've discussed up to this point, I think we're in a good position to just reframe our climate conversations and try to figure out what to do moving forward. We're going to cut here at the 25-ish minute mark, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.